have to get a list of all the armed robbery cases. And once again, this is not something that typically people keep track of. So what we did was we got the district attorney's office to essentially set up a computer run that would allow us to get a list of those cases that have been tried in the last couple of years. We wanted very new cases, so we looked at 2 years worth of cases, so we'd have enough numbers to be able to really draw some conclusions from. So the trickiest part is getting a list of the robbery cases to start with. And if you want to do something kind of in depth, you need to get enough of the cases where you can really draw some conclusions. If you only get a couple of cases, that boils down, you're slipping back towards anecdotal. And that's specifically what we were trying to avoid. We were trying to say, this isn't something that happens every once in a while, this happens routinely with these kind of cases. So once you can get a list of the cases, then to really examine how the cases were conducted, you really need to look at the trial transcripts. And what we did was we went to the appeals courts, and we were only looking at jury trials here. We were not looking at pleas, because in a plea you don't have a transcript. You don't have a full recitation of the facts of the case. You get bare bones kinds of things. So we wanted to know what kind of evidence was presented to a judge or a jury that would have demonstrated to them that this person actually did the crime. So we went to the appeals court where transcripts are routinely filed, and got copies of those transcripts where we could go through the transcripts and look at the kind of evidence that was being presented. So it's really kind of a two-step process of first getting a listing of the cases, and that can be done sometimes through open records, sometimes it has to be done through whatever the computer services, the information technology section of the county or the local jurisdiction is. And then secondly, once you get that list, to go where the trial transcripts are, where you can actually read the list of what evidence was presented at the trial. And this can be done anywhere. I mean, it's not unique to Dallas. So anybody can do that kind of thing. And if you don't necessarily have to do it with armed robberies. It depends on what you're looking for. Eyewitness identification was what we were looking for. So what we did was we first determined what's the quintessential eyewitness ID case. Almost everybody said robberies, so we made a list of robbery cases. That's how it worked here, but you wouldn't have to do robbery cases. If you wanted to look at some other facet, you could do murder cases. Now that's going to involve, we wanted to specifically exclude DNA cases too, but if you want to look at DNA kind of cases to see how DNA is being used, at what point do they do the DNA testing, something we kicked around on is, they say that we're not going to have these problems anymore because we have DNA evidence now. Well, at what point do they do the DNA testing? Do they do it before you're arrested? Do they do it before you're indicted? Do they do it before you go to trial? What if you got an innocent person who has to wait a year for them to do a DNA testing? Well, he's under the cloud of suspicion. And sometimes, depending on what the crime is, he's lost his job, he's lost his family, all kinds of things have happened just because he was accused of a crime. What do you do to avoid that kind of thing? So there are various ways to approach this and various types of crimes that you could use depending on what you wanted to illustrate.
Very good, thanks. Okay, two more questions. What do you think why do you think law enforcement officials continue to use eyewitness identifications in the face of so much research that says it's notoriously inaccurate?
Well, I have a flip answer, which is because it works. Because as long as they can do this, and prosecutors say, looks good to me, judges say the same, and juries say, well, okay, if the victim says that's him, we're going to go with the victim. As long as that process remains pretty much the way it has been, there's not sufficient impetus for them to change. It's not that they think they're doing anything wrong and they don't care. It's that this has always worked. There have not been questions raised to a great extent up until fairly recently. And even as the questions have been raised, if all you have, and this is typical of most jurisdictions, I think, if all you have is one wrongful conviction out of 10,000, then you can write it off to, well, this one, had a problem, but that doesn't mean they all have problems. So you can write it off to kind of an episodic thing as opposed to something that happens routinely. And I think that's happened a lot. Even in some of the bigger jurisdictions, they'll say things like, well, we try 10,000 murder cases a year, and we've only had a problem with one going back 25 years, so I don't think we need to jump the whole system and re-examine the whole system just because of that. What they don't look at is that the same factors that came into play in this wrongful conviction are a factor in a lot of your cases, maybe most of your cases. And just because those cases haven't come back as wrongful because there wasn't DNA or there wasn't other evidence that was presented to you, doesn't mean that you don't have a larger problem than just this one case. So they've done this because it works. They've done this because they haven't had sufficient pressure brought to bear on them to change. And they think they're doing it, they think they're doing the right thing. I mean, I don't think this is largely a situation of corruption amongst law enforcement. I think it's more along the lines of this is the way they've always done it. They're very resistant to changing. And until somebody says there are consequences for what you've done here, they change the law to say you're now breaking the law if you don't do it this way. The right person becomes an exoneree. You know, one of the problems you have with these exonerees is they tend to be kind of everyday people, people who have been in the system sometimes for a long time. They're not inherently sympathetic because maybe they didn't do this crime, but they've already pled guilty on other crimes. So it doesn't spur law enforcement to take a second look when the guy who's being identified as the criminal has a criminal history or is not an inherently sympathetic character. If it were someone of great note, someone who just didn't fit the pattern of the kind of person who commits these crimes, that can sometimes lead you to take an extra step to double check to see whether you've got the right person. But by and large, if you look around the country at the kind of people who have been exonerated, they are not typically choir boys, Boy Scouts who have never been in trouble with the law. They've had contact before. And the first thing any law enforcement officer does whenever he's got a criminal suspect is he runs his sheet. He runs his record to see whether he's been involved with the system. And the minute they find out, well, he's had prior involvement with the system, that puts you at a disadvantage because they're not going to approach this as cautiously as they would if you'd led a pristine life up until now. So I think that by and large, they do this because it works. They do this because they haven't brought it to their attention, had it brought to their attention that they're doing anything wrong. And law enforcement officers don't read social science studies. You know, they don't study what social scientists since the turn of the century have been saying. It will get their attention if the Supreme Court of the United States says, okay, from now on, if you don't tell people that they have the constitutional right to remain silent, your case is not going to be upheld. That gets their attention. But that doesn't happen very often, particularly in this day and age of a much more conservative Supreme Court. You don't have that kind of judicial involvement in these cases. So what gets their attention is more often than not publicity. We had a case in a smaller police department here north of Dallas in Richardson, Texas, which is a suburb, where they very highly they have a great reputation as a police department. And when they had an exoneration, it turned their world upside down. They couldn't believe this had happened to them. It happened to other places, but it couldn't happen to them because they were so cautious and so professional, and they were so far ahead of the curve in doing innovative things that this just couldn't possibly happen to them. It not only happened to them, it happened to a guy who is now the #2 guy in the department. He was a detective when the conviction came down more than 20 years ago, but now he's the #2 guy in the department. So it wasn't just some guy who had spent a couple of years in the police department and then moved on to something else. It was a guy who was still in the police department and had risen to become deputy chief. So it really hit home with them that this could happen anywhere, and they really needed to take a look at this, and they did, to their credit. They started looking immediately at their processes, and they made some changes very rapidly. But that's very unusual for a police department to do that. Most of them, they're big bureaucracies. They don't want to change. They want to write this off as an anomaly, and it takes a lot to get them to rethink their processes.
Wow. One pause and a reframe with a little shot variation. And we have our last question. I said because it works.
That's because you'd heard me say it